For this project, I conducted an interview with two winners of the first ever Academy of American Poets Climate Action Prize, judged by naturalist Bill McKibben and author Julia Alvarez.
I've always been interested in the environment, and I've always enjoyed being outdoors and hiking and things like that. And I guess my early interest in the environment, I come from an area in upstate New York, Binghamton, these small cities, Binghamton, Endicott, Endwell, and these are cities that were factory towns. It's the home of IBM. There were a lot of defense contractors in the 80s and 90s. So like in my early childhood and growing up in this area, there were a lot of things about ground level contamination, cancer clusters, things like that were all caused by, runoff from these facilities, things like that. So that's like an early kind of, entrance into the world of like thinking about climate change and the effects of industry on climate change and things like that. And that is a very visible thing that I could see unfolding in my life as a child and as a teenager and as a young adult. So you have the contrast between like the beauty of upstate New York with all these places to go hiking and into northern Pennsylvania, and these beautiful rural areas. And then you have these factories, and even when the factories kind of moved out and moved away, you have the legacy of that that you see in stark contrast to the landscape.
I think it's sort of always going to be a twofold answer. One, I imagine probably similar to you. Growing up in Yellowstone, you probably had a lot of the same experiences I did. But just being a kid out in nature. I'm from the DC area originally. And actually my dad was, he was a lobbyist for the coal industry. So that, was something that I didn't agree with and railed against and have continued to. But then I spent all my summers going out to my grandparents had a fish farm in Nebraska. So I did a lot of manual labor in the summers, but I also, after we were done hauling fish, I got to go just play in ponds and creeks and streams and catch salamanders. And, I had a collection of snapping turtles and stuff, which I imagine, I think that's how a lot of, I think nature is the gateway drug to environmentalism in a way, right? That we, we get to, be kind of, especially as kids, we are just kind of fully immersed in this world. And I think part of it, part of the reason, not that it can't happen when you're older, but I think part of the reason that we kind of have these really, I don't want to necessarily say spiritual, but it's a really kind of close connection with nature and with the natural world when we're kids, is because no one has beaten our imaginations out of us yet either. One of the things, one of the ways that I think that we need to care about stuff, it actually starts with language. So I'm going to kind of steal a couple of your later questions, but I think it's really connected here where, so one of the, my environmental idols is a writer named Robert McFarlane. The one of his that I read that was really important to me is called Landmarks. And it's about rewilding language. And the kind of thinking goes like this, and so this is going to get real sort of philosophical really quickly, but in philosophy, there's a branch of philosophy called epistemology, which basically deals with the limits of knowledge, right? What can we know and how do we know it? And there's sort of two main theories on this. One is just that reality exists, whether we know it's there or not. And then there's the kind of the other side of it, which is that reality is entirely constructed in our heads and it is made out of language, basically. I tend to fall kind of between those two things, which is to say that obviously a reality exists, whether we know it or not. But the breadth of reality, like the diversity of it, doesn't necessarily. Which is to say that, unless of all the names for 50 different species of butterfly, then there's really just one butterfly. There's butterfly. And you might know that there's a bunch of different ones, but it doesn't quite exist in the same like real way to you. If we don't know the names for all these things, then nature actually shrinks. And I really do think this is true. Like the size of it gets smaller. And it's easier for us to then kind of separate ourselves out, like, oh, what is human and what is natural, as though they're not somehow connected or really the same thing. And sort of the beauty and the challenge of it is that it's like the problem is the solution in a way, which is that like I think the way to care about environmental cataclysm is linguistic. Like I think the way that we care about it is the caring, if that sort of makes sense. And that's the way we fix it too.
In poetry, I would say the Victorian poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, he was a Jesuit priest, but he also wrote these amazing poems about the natural world. One of my favorites is Pied Beauty, and he starts that off, "Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles in all stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, finch's wings." So you have like this beautiful invocation of the natural world on a very minute level, but then also an expansiveness that's just like profoundly moving, separated from all of the religious content. It's just a profoundly, for me, like it's some of the most intense poetry of the natural world that, just continually moves me, and I'm continually drawn back to. Just like you have the urge to be in nature sometimes, you also have the urge to, revisit nature through the imagination of a poet like Gerard Manley Hopkins. So he's one of the big ones for me, and his way of thinking about the natural world, paying attention to the natural world. I guess that's one of the kind of connective points between like activism and poetry. Like poetry begins when we surrender our intention or our intentionality and we begin to pay attention. And I think activism in any way is about paying attention, right? And that's where we're going to be able to affect the most change in terms of climate action, is just getting everyday people to pay attention. Remaining open to other people, doing what you can, and being vocal when you can.
Like my interviewees, my journey with climate activism originates in place. I've grown up on the edge of Yellowstone National Park and am used to extreme conditions. This picture sums up my existence quite accurately. Since I was 5 years old, I've also spent about an eighth of my life in Butte, Montana, home of the Berkeley Pit, one of Montana's very own Superfund sites. My tolerance of extreme conditions, however, does not extend to climate change, and I hope to remain open to other ideas and to use my creativity to make a difference.